In this section of Wisconsin Peoples and Federal Indian Policy, we're going to focus first on indigenous sovereignty and the rights that are embedded in the treaty process and in U.S. law. And then we'll look at 3 key treaties that open Wisconsin to settlement. But let's go back a little bit. To recap, in the first phase, discovery, conquest, and treaty making, Indian people were recognized as legitimate entities capable of dealing with European nations through the treaty process, and that the United States government, when it came into power, assumed the same role of the British and Spanish governments in making treaties with the Indian tribes. And then after the United States secured its independence during the Revolution, they gained the sole right to negotiate with the tribes in what was called the Northwest Territory. And of course, that is where Wisconsin is. So, the first principle of Indian sovereignty is what's called absolute sovereignty. And this is how nations negotiate between each other, recognizing that they are independent and they are sovereign political entities. So that's important to recognize, that when the United States negotiated with the tribes, they recognize them as having absolute sovereignty. In our government system, we have what's called divided sovereignty. The federal government has certain rights of rule, and the state governments and the local governments have also certain rule. This political power then divided up between various different agencies. This is the same situation that relates with American Indians living within the borders of the United States. They have sovereignty that's enumerated by law or custom. So this kind of divided sovereignty that I mentioned resembles very similar to what we'd expect for states and counties. And it's enshrined in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which is the Federal Commerce Clause. Embedded within this clause is the idea that the United States recognized tribes as independent and sovereign powers, which in turn encompasses the related concept of inherent sovereignty. And by that we mean that the tribes always had this sovereignty. The Constitution didn't grant the tribes this sovereignty. They always had it. It was inherent in who they were. Now, when the tribes negotiated with the United States for various different agreements, they always include certain things within these treaties. And one of the most important things that they asked for was the continued use of the land that they ceded to the government. Now, these reserved rights or retained rights are also referred to as, in legal terms, as usufructuary rights. And this was something that is very important for Wisconsin Indians, that they did not give up the use of the lands because they recognized that this was their livelihood. The lands were, in fact, how they lived and survived. So these retained rights or reserved rights are very important for understanding Wisconsin treaty rights. Now there are what's called the trilogy, the Marshall Trilogy of Indian sovereignty as interpreted by the Supreme Court. And this establishes the law where it defined the United States' relationship with the tribes, where this divided sovereignty or dual sovereignty is enshrined. And the United States also recognized that it had what was called a federal trust responsibility, the federal government's responsibility to take care of the tribes that existed within the borders of the United States. And these were well defined in these cases. So that's the beginning stage of the treaty process. We're going to move into phase 2, which is the removal and relocation. This is important to recognize right now because it's going to have a huge impact on the Wisconsin territory and the Wisconsin tribes. At this point, the United States began to move from a period of belief in civilization programs towards Native peoples to the removal of Native peoples completely from the United States territory. And then they fought to extinguish Indian land claims, all the claims that the Indians had, for example, whether they're in the East Coast whether in the Northeast or in the Southeast, all tribes were going to be expected to extinguish their land rights and then move to what was called Indian Territory. This was the initial idea for Indian Territory, the location of it. You'll see it takes up most of all of Oklahoma, Kansas, and half of Nebraska. This was Indian country, and it had been in the minds of federal policymakers since the 1820s. In anticipation of removing these tribes, they needed a place to put them, and they were going to be using this newly created place. So in Wisconsin, early treaties were based on this idea of creating space within Wisconsin for moving tribes from the east into Wisconsin, because Wisconsin was also considered a possible place for tribes. And it was also essential for the United States to open up some of these lands for white settlement. Here we see the pattern of removal as it existed in the 1830s into the 40s. So you'll see the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, the Seminole, and some of the other tribes. And then you'll also see tribes in the East who are being moved into the territories. So this was a plan that was put into effect during the Jackson administration, most famously known as the Trail of Tears. Wisconsin plays a role in this as well. Now this is an example of a rendering of Fort Howard, which was in Green Bay. This was right after the War of 1812, when the United States started to look more closely at the Northwest Territory now that the British had been essentially kicked out of the area. Fort Howard was there to project American military power and to begin laying the seeds for establishment of control of the riverways, which were essential for trade. The first important treaty was the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, and the American negotiators called this council in the September of the 1825, inviting the tribes of the Ojibwe, the Lakota, the Winnebago, the Menominee, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, and the Sauk and Fox. The goal here was to take over the trade from the British and facilitate trade, and also to control the region by suppressing hostilities. The goal here was for the Americans to create a dividing line between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and also between the Ojibwe and the Dakota. The Indians supported peace between the warring tribes, but they objected to the American idea of boundaries between the tribes to prevent clashes. They argued that in their tradition, access to land was shared. Notwithstanding, the tribes signed the treaty, but the hostilities between particularly the Ojibwe and the Lakota were only temporarily suspended. Game was not scarce at this time, so while the American gifts were appreciated, the treaty payments were not necessary, and the United States was not strong enough militarily to enforce this treaty. The next treaty was the Treaty of Butimore in 1827. This was on the grounds of the Fox River, and it was really designed to push further this concept of boundaries. At this point, it was a question of boundaries between the Menominee and the Ojibwe, but there were other tribes also invited, including the Winnebago, and then two so-called New York Indians, and they were the Oneida and the Stockbridge-Munsee. And of course, the Stockbridge-Munsee had initially been in Massachusetts and had been moved into western New York because of the revolution, after the Revolution. With this treaty, the United States wanted clear boundaries so that land cessions could be more easily accomplished. In other words, it would be easier to purchase land from one tribe than from several. The Ojibwe, the Menominee, and the Winnebago chiefs agreed to the border. And it's significant the United States also appointed Oshkosh chief of the Menominee, although at the time he was not recognized by the tribe. So it's the United States inserting itself into the political works of these different tribes by identifying Chief Oshkosh as their principal chief. Then we have the Treaty of Chicago in 1833, which was principally organized around moving the Potawatomi people. And that was an important point in the Potawatomi. Some of them had ceded southwest Michigan. A number of them refused to move, even after this treaty. Many of them ended up being moved, however, into the Kansas Territory. So go back to this map again. I wanted to point out another place. You might see this spot up in the top here. This related to the Sauk and Fox Indians, who were an amalgamated tribe from the earlier days of wars with the French. And the Sauk and Fox Indians were also being forced to move into Indian Territory at this point. In this instance, though, resistance was organized by a leader known as Black Hawk, who refused to move his particular band, what was known as the British Band, because he had supported the British in the War of 1812. And in 1832, Black Hawk and his band returned to Illinois at the invitation of the Potawatomi, but the governor of Illinois called up the militia to force them out. This began what was called the Black Hawk War. It wasn't really much of a war. It was essentially the army chasing the Sauk and Fox and other Indian forces into Wisconsin, where many were killed at the Battle of Bad Axe. So after the series of land secessions, this is what Wisconsin looked like by the 1850s. And this is the rest of the reservation lands of Wisconsin present day.